Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is an ongoing series of lectures for my class. For this one, it is going to be for my corrections class, and we're going to start with Chapter 1. Basically, what this is defining exactly what corrections is and all of the history that sort of preceded what is the modern day correctional system. So, the role of corrections in the criminal justice system, it is about punishment. Police effect arrests, courts adjudicate, and then when someone is sentenced, they go to prison, jail, or some sort of alternative, maybe parole, probation, things of that nature. So, what corrections is? It is about punishing the offender and preventing future unwanted acts. Corrections is a process where practitioners in various agencies, notice we're not just talking about people that work in jails or prisons, but it can be other people, other agencies that assist. So they engage in both organized security and treatment, because one of the tenets of the criminal justice system is that once a person enters that criminal justice system, we want them to leave better than when they first arrived in it. The goal is to correct criminal tendencies. So that's one part of the criminal justice system. The other four segments: law enforcement, policing, the courts, where they render verdicts, the juvenile justice system. We'll probably talk a little bit about that way later in the semester. But there is sort of one system for just adults, and then there is another system for juveniles. And really, it plays with ages and offenses committed, and it can be very confusing. And then lastly, victim services. Okay, punishment and corrections. Punishment and corrections is not synonymous, but they do work together. We want to punish and we also want to correct behavior. There's this idea of the brutalization hypothesis that treating prisoners brutally sensitizes people to violence, means we start getting them used to violence, and it teaches them to use violence as a tool for attention, to get the things that they want. I am now on slide number 7, early codes of law. Babylonian and Sumerian codes, they were harsh punishments, but they were uniform. If you committed this offense, you received this punishment. And they were as impartial as they could be. What we're talking about here is the Code of Hammurabi. Maybe some of you have heard that term before, maybe some of you haven't, but everyone has heard this term: an eye for an eye. Roman law and punishment. So we're talking ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, if someone was accused of an offense, they were imprisoned, and they would have to wait until a verdict was rendered. And obviously, the verdict would have to be innocent for them to be removed from basically what amounted to be a cage. In Western Europe and East Asia, if you were convicted of an offense, the term that they use is penal servitude. Basically, that is a synonym for slavery. So you were a slave to the state for a specified amount of time. Now on slide number 8, early historical role of religion, punishment, and corrections. In the Middle Ages, uh, there were governments, obviously, there were monarchies all around Europe and in other countries as well. But at least we're focusing on Europe because Europe sort of gives us our standard American criminal justice system. The church was the arbiter of the criminal justice system. They decided who was innocent, who was guilty. So the church's role in the justice system. Now, the bullet point here is that there was a large peasantry class. So we're talking about peasants. These are people that worked from dawn to dusk, tilling lands, things of that nature. They were not educated, so they were illiterate. However, if you were a member of the church, you were literate. You probably spoke 2 or 3 different languages and definitely could at least read them. In order to determine guilt If someone was accused of an offense, what they would do is they would do something called trial by ordeal, meaning if you survived the ordeal, you were innocent. If you didn't survive the ordeal, you were guilty. This was done during the Spanish Inquisition to test to see if people were witches, if women were witches more often than not. So tests to prove innocence or guilt, like dipping your hand in boiling water for 3 days. If you survived that, you were innocent. If you didn't survive that, you were guilty. Saving the souls of condemned, why people were burned at the stake. They figured that if you burn a person at the stake, the soul leaves the body, and as the soul leaves the body, God forgives it. But the church also provided sanctuary, so offenders could stay in the church while waiting for their judgment or waiting for their trial by ordeal. Slide number 9, early secular history of punishment and corrections. So now the emphasis is shifting from church to state. So the state is now the arbiter of the criminal justice system. So state sovereignty or state rule is increasing. Crimes are considered offenses against the state, so against society. So the government, not church, would exact the punishments or would exact fines and receive those fines. Public wrongs, crimes against society, things like treason, witchcraft, incest. Private wrongs would receive private revenge. Let's say we're talking about physical injury, property damage, and or theft. Slide number 10 shows some early types of punishments in these sort of early correctional systems. You can read it for yourself. They were usually pretty harsh. So now I am on slide number 13, excuse me. William Penn, the Quakers, and the Great Law. So now what we're doing is we're starting to reform these ideas of corrections. Loss of liberty, but instead of doing a trial by ordeal, if you were convicted of an offense, what you would do is you would do hard labor. So you would work for the state. You would pay your debt to society by working. And William Penn felt that this was more effective than the death penalty. William Penn also believed in religious freedom. And if you think about it, the Quakers were leaving the Church of England, so there is a historical context for that, and also believed in the fact that humans do have rights, which is sort of a precursor to our American criminal justice system, to the Constitution, to the Declaration of Independence. Some three other social theorists that I'd like to mention: Charles Montesquieu, Francis Voltaire, and Cesare Beccaria. Charles Montesquieu was very interested in the abuse of law by practitioners of law. Voltaire, famous author, also a social theorist, posited the notion that there were two criminal justice systems operating at the same time, one for rich people and one for poor people. And that sort of sounds semi-true today. And Charles Beccaria was against the death penalty, that the state doesn't have the right to take life. Punishment is for prevention, not retribution. Imprisonment is in of itself a punishment. All three of them, or really all four of them, focused on human rights and proportionality, that let the sanction or the punishment fit the crime, but it would have to also be humane. And these social theorists were the first to posit the notion that corrections should also be in the rehabilitation business. That, okay, while you're serving your debt to society and you're performing labor, we want to rehabilitate you. And what's the reason for that? To prevent future criminal conduct. John Howard, The Making of the Penitentiary, State of Prisons to Improve Conditions. Even if found innocent, you could be fined and jailed for non-payment. So if you were fined and couldn't pay, well, then you would go to jail, sort of a precursor to our bail system. Jeremy Bentham, The Hedonistic Calculus. Punishment is a deterrent because humans have this sort of pain-pleasure index, and more often than not, humans would err on the side of pleasure. So if we can create punishment as a pain, human beings would probably, hopefully, try and avoid that pain, so avoid the punishment and then avoid the behavior that would beget that punishment. Classical criminology, we're talking about Beccaria again. Punishment should be useful, purposeful, and reasonable, and proportional. I am now on slide number 16. A lot of this history I'm not going to probably test too much on, but I think it's good to at least have this starting context. So the first four prisons that were opened in the United States, Old Newgate Prison in Connecticut in 1773. This is the first prison. So it is a state prison. It was the first prison erected in the United States, and its claim to fame was that housing conditions for the prisoners, they were underground, and these prisoners performed hard labor in copper mines. In Pennsylvania, the Walnut Street Jail, 1790, closed in 1835, was more about reforming offenders. And two other Pennsylvania prisons, Western State and Eastern State Penitentiary. Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh, inmates work together as day laborers. So the state gains an economic advantage with this idea of cheap labor. In the Eastern State Penitentiary, founded in 1829, a prisoner spent 24 hours a day in a cell, no labor. I'm skipping to slide number 19. The Southern system pre-Civil War, black codes, meaning that black people, African Americans, received harsher penalties and harsher punishments than their Caucasian counterparts accused of the same offense. Post-Civil War, so now slavery has been abolished. However, prisoners were now used as plantation workers. So basically, they take the place of what slaves used to do. Western system holding cells for inmates, contracted custody with other states, eventually adopted that Auburn system that we just talked about. Okay, so we're getting to the Reform era. National Prison Association of 1870 drafted the Declaration of Principles in Cincinnati, Ohio, reform prisoners over punishing prisoners. Classification of inmates. Are they violent? What kind of offenses did they commit? Did they commit nonviolent felonies, violent felonies, things of that nature? Indeterminate sentences, meaning that if you showed good behavior, you could take time off your sentence. And self-efficacy. Inmates had self-respect, and and giving them self-respect starts that reformation process. The Elmira Reformatory individualized plans of reform evidence show limited success in rehabilitation, and that's something that we're going to be talking about all semester. That although there are proponents of rehabilitation, and I don't have an issue with that, one of the things that we really have to sort of realize is that rehabilitation works some of the time. Rehabilitation does not work all of the time. Slide number 23, prison farming systems, they're profit driven, based on agriculture. The Arkansas system, not a great system, that there were inmates in charge of other inmates, and this bred corruption, extortion, weapons inside the jails, inside the prisons, being held by the prisoners, and with withholding of foods, medicines, things of that nature. The progressive era, which is where we sort of are right now, the humane treatment of inmates, and the recognizing the fact of this concept called deviance, that there are social and psychological causes to crime, so that there are social and psychological causes as to why inmates or people convicted of offenses commit the behavior that they do. These could be family conditions, environmental conditions, socioeconomic conditions, psychological and or mental health conditions. I am going to skip the rest of 23 and 24. So we'll hit to 26. The Federal Bureau of Prisons. So we're talking about corrections today, 1930. 100 facilities, 50% are drug offenders. 12% are citizens of other countries. So 1 in 10 comes from another country, is some sort of undocumented person. 50% are in low or minimum security risk. The average time served is about 6.5 years. In state corrections, over 50%. Can't give you an exact number. This varies anywhere from 50 to 60%. Violent offenders, more common form of corrections. The last slide, like I said, this was going to be a fairly quick lesson. The four largest state correctional systems in the United States of America: Texas, Florida, California, and New York. These big four states have large free world populations, and they represent the diversity of the population. And these states, up until maybe the time of the pandemic, had robust or strong economies. All right, so that was my quick lesson for corrections. Be ready for chapter 2. It's going to be coming. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.